Here we go. Good evening. I'm Donna Schneider, president of the Prince George's County Historical Society, and welcome to the Society's July 25th, 2022 History Chat with Jack Thompson Jr. Jack and I will be discussing his home in Nottingham. We will be recording the chat, so please mute your microphones. The recording will be posted on our YouTube channel, which can be found on our website, www.pghistory.org. We will be answering questions after the chat, so please put your questions in the chat box and we will get to as many of them as possible at the end. Now a little bit about Jack. I first met Jack when we were both volunteering with the Prince George's County Historical and Cultural Trust. It's been at least 25 years ago, I think, Jack. So yes, it's been quite a while we've been friends. He serves on the executive committee of the Maryland House and Garden Pilgrimage as its past president and its first male president. He also chaired 3 Prince George's County House and Garden Pilgrimage tours, with the last one being this spring. Jack manages the Addison Chapel Foundation and Chapel, and he also is the vice president of our Historical Society. Let's see. He is very active in his church, St. Thomas Parish. Jack was appointed as a commissioner to the Prince George's County Historic Preservation Commission and did that for several years. His general knowledge of historic preservation aided him as he personally restored 3 historic homes, 2 of which have been on the House and Garden Pilgrimage. He's also hosted several society events at his homes. One in Nottingham, which we're going to talk about tonight, Magnolia Knoll, and Beechwood in Upper Marlborough. On a professional level, Jack owns a home improvement company, Jack Thompson Corporation, and his own real estate company, Results Brokerage Company. So welcome, Jack, and thank you for doing this chat tonight. So let's start off with a basic question. Where is Nottingham?
Nottingham is located in southern Prince George's County. It's at the very bottom part of Upper Marlborough, and it's located on the Patuxent River below Croom and Baden, off of Route 301.
Okay, so can you tell us a little bit about Nottingham, its history and things like that?
Sure. Nottingham, it's located on a terrace on the Patuxent River. And it's.
You want me to throw up the map?
No, that's for later. It's located on the terrace, and it's actually kind of a neat area because the elevation is pretty high off of the river. We're not really down at the river level like so much of the Patuxent River is as you go south. And the site contains an important record of over 5,000 years of prehistory, which corresponds to the village of the Mattapamint, which was depicted on John Smith's 1608 map when he was traveling up and down the riverways. In 1696, Nottingham had not been formed, but it was actually part of Thomas Brooks' property called Mattapamint Landing. And Thomas Brook is an interesting character because nobody really knows where his house is. Anybody that has a house in the Nottingham district, which extended all the way up to Brandywine, we all like to say that Thomas Brooke lived in our houses. My first house was Mattapamint Farm, and it dated to the 18th century. And I always thought that Thomas Brooke might have actually lived in my house, and then he could have lived in Brookfield of the Berries, or he could have lived at some other places. But anyways, this was all his plantation, and it went to the river. And in 1706, there was an act for the advancement of trade and erected ports and towns up and down the Patuxent River. And this was enacted by the Queen of England, and many of the ports were created. A lot of you might know of Queen Anne's Town, and there was Magruder, there was a few other ones in Prince George's County. And then, of course, there's several that were in Calvert County, going down. But Nottingham is a pretty good place because the water depth is about 30 feet deep. I've heard it goes as deep as almost 40 feet deep especially in front of my house. The channel comes up right to the Nottingham shore. Even though it's pretty wide, it's kind of cool that it's literally about 20 feet off of the shore it drops into a cliff into the channel. And that is the reason it was created, because for the ships and vessels. And what it was created for was the trade of black slaves, goods, and others wares. Nottingham was named to be an official tobacco inspection station, I think around 1747. Tobacco shipping was noted that in the 18th century, they, like between 1791 and 1801, over 8,340 pounds of hogheads were, which is a hoghead is 400 to 500 pounds of tobacco were shipped out of the town. So Nottingham's main purpose was the shipment of tobacco to England. And of course, one of the dark past of Nottingham is that it was an auction place where slaves were locally born slaves were sold at the slave auction houses that were there, and also slave ships had come in, and it was a major slave shipping port. The funny thing about the farms and farm around Nottingham is that it's very dry down there in Nottingham, and there's record keeping of even back in the 18th century that the farmers, the farms and plantations down there, their crops would dry up because of the droughts, and the soil down there is very sandy, very loomy, and it tends not to be that great. But it's great for tobacco, but it's not great for too much. I know down in Nottingham, I have to water all the time, so it gets so dry during the middle of summer. Nottingham was also known for horse racing in the 18th century. It was a well-known place for races for the affluent county residents. And for many years, the Nottingham Road and Tanyard Road is actually part of the original racing track. And it was, Governor Bowie, and there was a lot of famous races down in Nottingham. Something interesting about in 1785, the Maryland General Assembly it actually was in 1782. They wanted to have more districts formed because it was only 2. So in 1785, 10 were formed, and the Nottingham Mattapani district was the first district in Prince George's County being vested. And it was actually so until 1971. Another thing pretty interesting about Nottingham is that during the summer of 1814, it was August 21st, the British actually arrived to Nottingham, and there's a lot. I could go on all night about the history of the war and what happened and how they left, and then they came back, and then they found out they were coming. The British were coming, but basically, when the British got to Nottingham, it was completely deserted. The fires were still warm. There was not a soul in the town. So, and at that time, there was 12 to 1,500 residents. Everybody had fled when they knew they were coming. One of there was a couple, Maryland locally famous citizens of Nottingham through the years. And of course, I'm probably the most famous. But no, Nottingham's first citizen was Governor Robert Bowie, and he was a 4-time governor. And he resided at the Cedars, and I think Donna has a picture of the Cedars. The picture of the Cedars that she's going to show you was the house in the 30s. This is a picture of the house in the 1930s. When the first house that he built was a gambrel roof frame structure, and then in the late 18th century, he built the side hall double parlor, 2.5-story house with the double chimneys on it. That was a very fine house that unfortunately did not make it. And in the 1950s, the house was razed by the Downing family. Governor Bowie was also pretty well known for the fact that he married Priscilla Makel, and it was a very controversial marriage because she was 15 and he was 19. And the wedding was blessed by his family, and so it happened. Another person of interest is Benjamin Conti. He was born in Nottingham, and he was an American Episcopal priest and a statesman from Maryland. And he was also an officer in the American Revolutionary War and a delegate to the Confederate Congress and a member of the House of Representatives. And so then we move on to the 1840s. By the 1840s, the steamship lines had started operating from Baltimore to the river towns. And so the steamships were pretty cool because they would then take goods and tobacco and people back and forth. I remember when I moved down there that people remembered their parents talking about going to Baltimore, and they would go up on these steamboats, and they were huge. I mean, they were gigantic, and they would actually come up the river. And Nottingham was the last stop, and so by the 1840s, they had started operating, like I said, and then basically by the 20s, the steamships had stopped, and there was a cannery down there called the Woodfield Canning Company, and they were actually by the Weems warehouses, which was down the road. My property was on North Street, and I'll talk more about that later. But the William Quinn Hotel and these different places were down there. But by the 20s, the steamboats actually stopped. The cannery closed down. And so basically by, the 50s, the place had dwindled down to maybe 30 to 40 citizens. But what really kind of erased a lot of Nottingham was in 1901, there was a devastating fire, and it destroyed most of Nottingham. Only a few of places survived. The story or rumor has it that the reason why my house is still standing is because they actually had buckets of water, and they were taking them from the river, and they were stopping the flames as they were starting to burn the house down. So they had some type of, they had a line of people, and they had buckets and water, and they just kept going around the house with the buckets of water. And supposedly that's what saved the house. And the Great Fire of Nottingham of 1901 actually was seen in Baden. People from all over remember seeing the flames from everything burning in Nottingham. The only places that survived the fire that I know of was my house, was the house next door, which I knew as Grandma Downing's house, and then the Plater house survived, and then the stamp store survived. Now, the interesting thing about it is that
You want to put
Nottingham,
the stamp store up?
yeah, you can show the stamp store. Yeah, the stamp store was the last commercial store in Nottingham. And it was I mean, what a beauty. It's too bad it burned down, but in 1985 it burned down. And the very interesting thing about it, it had a bar in it, and the bar, fortunately, the Downings family, Dent Downing, they did take the bar out of there, and it ended up in a hotel, I believe, in North or South Carolina, and it still survives today because the Downings wouldn't get rid of anything. He held on to every single thing he ever had, but for some reason that bar went, and I think it had something to do with a family member that was involved at this hotel. I'm not quite sure about that, but I think that's why that bar made it. But that store burned down in '85. Nottingham pretty much became a farming community, you know, because it was no longer really a town, and most of the land was bought by the Windsor family and the Downing family, and a lot of it was bought, I guess, around the Depression time, and so the Downings had owned a majority of the land in between Tanyard and Nottingham Road, and then they owned all the land on the other side of Tanyard Road. And then the Windsor family owned pretty much of the rest of the land around there. So they continued to farm it, and tobacco was growing down in that region until the Great Tobacco Buyout. And Dent Downing owned, Gordon Downing owned one particular part of the farm, and Dent Downing owned the middle part of the farm, which was between Nottingham and Tanyard Road. And he sold 50 acres of it to Park and Planet, along with the land next door to me. And so it's preserved, thank God. And the other part of has been subdivided, and we now have new homes going in down there. But it's at the very top of Nottingham Road as you come down off Caney Hill, Nottingham. So it doesn't really ruin the integrity of actual Nottingham that's left. So that's kind of pretty much a quick history of Nottingham.
Okay, so let's talk about your house.
Okay, yeah, my house is actually known as the Turton Smith House or Magnolia Knoll because we have really large magnolias that are on the property. The house was built by Richard Turton in 1850. However, I found evidence that there was a house, a part of a house that was there as early as 1842. But Richard Turton, he died at the age of 28. And he died in 1857. Now, when Turton Smith had it, if you're reviewing the picture of the house that's up on the screen, it was not what you see today. Basically, what it was a 2-room house. It had a room on the first floor, 1 bedroom on the second, and it had an attic room and a staircase. It was 1 room deep, and it had a fireplace on the end, on the right side, if you're facing the house. So when he died, this is when the house then becomes affiliated with the African American history of the community. It was then became owned by the Savoy family. And the Savoy family was a pretty prominent family. There's records of the Savoys that owned my house being freed before 1860. And so what the Savoys did is the Savoy family actually increased the size of the house. They added that salt box type of front that you're looking at on the house, on the front plane of the house. The actual front, by the way, is a riverside. This is actually the back of the house. But when you drive in the driveway, it is the front of the house in today's world. So the front part, the Savoys actually added on the front part of the house where the porch back is. And there was a two-story addition that originally came out to the right, a very small two-story addition that was demolished. Now, in 1905, Dewitt L. Washington bought the house in 1905, and he owned it until 1933. During Mr. Washington's ownership, and he was also an African American. I also want to point out that the summer kitchen on the right side was actually one of the original buildings that dates back to that period of the 1850s. Now, Mr. Washington, he did some interesting things to the house. He added the wraparound porch that faced the river. He added that front porch on the front, and he also, on the left side, you'll see a 1.5 story addition. That was actually up the street, and it was one of the little houses in what was left of Nottingham that didn't burn, and it was rolled down on logs and attached to the house. So it actually predates the entire house, but it was moved, which was not, that was a very common thing to do because back in those days, there wasn't a lot of money and everybody used everything that they could use from any house. Even if the house or barn was torn down, the materials would be used in constructing or adding on to a structure. So, but that's a pretty significant, and it actually has some pegging going on where the roof rafters connect. And so it's a very interesting addition. So it was added on. So after his ownership, it was then bought by, it was then part of the Downing family. The Downings were buying a lot of property, but then it became part of the Ryan family and the Buck family. And the Ryans owned it all the way until about 1968. In 1968, the Ryan family, when the last Ryan member, it was a brother and sister. When the brother passed away, it went to Hilda Buck of Upper Marlboro. And they then in turn sold it to the Smith family. And the Smiths owned it until about 1998, and then I became the owner of it in 1998, and I have owned it since. I think, Danny, you have one more picture of the river view. And that is the view from the back porch. And at the dock that you see, if you just go about 3 feet from that dock, it literally drops over 30 feet deep. It's like a cliff. And the current and the undertow in the river is so bad that it's dangerous to swim in that river. People have drowned. It has such a bad undertow. But as you can see, the view from the house is spectacular. There is no development. Now, I imagine that many, many years ago, all those trees that you see across the river, they were gone, and it was actually farms. I've seen pictures of that view with barns and houses across the river because everything was being farmed. But over the years, the trees have grown back, and so now it has a very natural look. Now,
I was going to say, what is
that's
across the river?
That's Calvert County, and if you went straight from that dock out, you would go to downtown Dunkirk. Dunkirk is literally, if I could walk, I could be there in about 15 minutes. But unfortunately, you have to drive all the way up to Waston's Corner and around to get there. But so that's the view. Now, in the prior picture of the house, when the summer kitchen, which was the building on the right. That building is a pretty interesting building because for years and years and years after the summer kitchen was abandoned, a lot of gentlemen from Washington, D.C. would come down to Nottingham to hunt railbirds. And the reason why the reason why there are no more railbirds is because there's no rice grass, because the Phragmites is taking over. And I know there's a push to get rice grass back, but the interesting thing is that the pushers, and that's what they would call the guys that would push the boats through the marsh. They would push them through, and then they would shoot the railbird. I mean, the hunters would shoot the railbirds, and then the dogs would go out and get the birds and bring them back, and then they would come back. But the pushers would stay in this building, and through the years, a lot of the descendants of the pushers were actually, one man that I met actually stayed in that building when they would push for the hunting for the railbirds. It's kind of an interesting thing. Railbird, that was a huge thing for many years. So that pretty much describes that. Now, when I took possession of the house, it was in a very bad state, and I did restore the house, and the cedar shakes were added in the late 1800s. And they were all buckled. And one of the reasons why the cedar shakes were buckled on the house was because cedar shakes are supposed to have a 6-inch reveal, and mine have an 8-inch reveal, which is from top to bottom is 8 inches, but normally there's 6 inches. And they were also done, it was also done with white cedar. Well, white cedar cannot handle an 8-inch reveal. And so I always had a lot of issues with buckling. So when I restored the house, I had to replace all the cedar shakes on the south, east, and west side. The north side were fine, so I didn't have to restore those, or under the porches. So I ended up getting red cedar from up in Canada, because all the virgin red cedar trees in America are gone, unfortunately. So we had to get virgin trees from up in northern Canada. And so I ended up getting, because I wanted to keep the original profile of the 8-inch reveal. So that was a remedy to stop the buckling from happening, and they would last for another 100 or 200 years. So I replaced with the virgin red cedar shakes. And also the sills had to be done, and it was a lot of work that had to be done, and the windows had to be restored. And that's how that was pretty much it. The restoration process was sort of a slow process, because I did things as I could afford to do them at the time. Of special note, if you look at the picture, you'll see some of the larger boxwoods. These boxwoods I moved to the property. They came from St. Thomas Church. They were actually under a magnolia tree, and magnolia trees are poisonous to boxwoods, and they were doing very badly. And so Franklin Robinson said, in the church, said I could have them. I just had to have them removed or transplanted. And so I did, and they were older boxwoods, and I had them moved by a professional landscaper, and they survived, which is a feat in its own right, because if anybody knows anything about transferring older boxwoods, it's almost impossible that they live. But every one of them lived. Some of them went down to, if you look at the one building of the summer kitchen, you'll see one there that really looks kind of, the shape is really weird, because basically when a stalk or a branch would die, I cut it out, because you have to cut out the dead branches or the whole thing will die. So I went down to just a couple of the branches left, and now and then survived, and so now it's coming back. So that had to be done for a few of them, but these are actually from the St. Thomas Church. So I think that's a pretty pretty neat significance. And so I transplanted those there. So that pretty much talks about the house.
So just so I've got this right. The building that's right in the foreground, the front on the right, that's the summer kitchen.
That's the summer kitchen, yes. And that's where all the food was always cooked.
Okay. So because I know that now is your office.
Well, actually, it's like a little like a sort of a guest house.
House, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. So, I mean, you said you replaced the shingles and the sills on the windows, but I mean, this is because of where it is, isn't it a constant battle with having to paint and keep it because it's near the water?
No, actually, it's no problem at all because the cedar shakes allow moisture, so the paint adheres. So I actually, the house hardly ever needs to be painted. It really holds up very well. And the windows are doing pretty well. I do need to get an HWP and get storm windows eventually, because that would make a big difference with protecting the windows. But the windows are 19th century pine. And, just like everybody always says, when you deal with this, virgin heart pine, it's amazing how well they hold up and they just don't rot. The windows do need maintenance. They do have to be reglazed a lot and painted. But one thing that I want to do, I would like to point out about the windows, the 2/2 windows, is that my windows are a little bit different than most normal windows. Most normal windows are glazed on the outside, but these windows originally and still have a actual wood strip, a very small piece of wood strip that frames the glass in. And so if a pane of glass breaks, you just gently remove these little strips. You could take the piece of glass out, put a piece of glass in, and you put the strips right back. They're very small nails. And then you paint, and they do an incredibly great job. And so they don't really need to be reglazed. So that's kind of a neat feature that is unusual for 2/2 windows.
So I remember hearing a story about them rolling hogsheads down to the river, on the left side of your house?
Yeah, that's right. That was, and I forgot to talk about that earlier, but basically that the left side is North Street, and North Street is partially on my property, and a lot of it is actually. And that is where they did roll the hogsheads to the ships. So the ships were actually down there and docked, and they rolled the hogsheads down there. And what's really interesting is that in that ravine, and there used to be when the Smiths bought it, the Ryans, they had a houseboat down there that was actually built up on a foundation, and it was really cool. I wish it'd be great if it was still there, but it was like a little guest house houseboat that was raised, and I think it was eaten out by termites and they tore it down, but kind of a cool thing. But yeah, they would roll the hogsheads down to the ship.
And also to the left is Nottingham School?
Yeah, Nottingham School is there, and also the River Keeper is in Grandma Downing's house. And the schoolhouse that's there is not the original schoolhouse. It's a rebuilt schoolhouse. The original schoolhouse was rebuilt, and Park and Planning has been keeping it in a pretty good state.
Yes.
It is actually not open, but it's open by appointment. But if you come to Nottingham, you can go over there and look in the windows, and it's completely set up as a school. Matter of fact, I had a couple of the desks that came out of that school that were up in the attic, and I gave them back to Park and Planning when they restored it. And I still have the original teacher's bell.
Yeah.
That was from the school.
Yeah, I also remember when we were doing the War of 1812 celebrations in the county. They were doing archaeology in front of your house, right? And they were finding things from, little buttons and stuff like that from when the British were stationed or living in front of your house for a day or so.
Oh yeah, yeah. It's a treasure trove of artifacts, all the way from from the prehistoric time to the Indians, and there's just so much stuff there. I mean, when people come in with metal detectors, they find so much coins and stuff of that nature. You find arrowheads. You find there's a lot of artifacts in that area.
So is Park and Planning going to go back out and do any more archaeology there?
I don't think so. I think I think they finished all their archaeology. Yeah.
Okay.
They did that for a few years.
So, let's see. I was gonna say, can you share with our audience a little bit about the process you have to go through for being able to do exterior work, at least on a historic house?
Well, you have to get a historical area work permit, and you have to go through the process, and you have to, of course, submit what you're going to do and make sure that everything that you're doing is within the standards.
Right. You have to be within the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation.
Yes.
Yeah. So, yeah. And then depending on what you're doing, sometimes they have to go, the historic area work permits have to go in front of the Prince George's County Historic Preservation Commission for review and approval.
Yeah, usually for maintenance work, it can be a staff write-off, but if you're doing some significant changes or something that affects the historical character of the property, then it would then go before a review hearing in front of the commissioners, the HBC. Yes.
Okay, let's see, what time is it? Okay, so is there anything else you wanted to share about the history of Nottingham or your house, or?
No, I think that I think that the interesting part about my house is that it is part of the African American history of the county, and it's in the books, and it's pretty significant property because it has a lot of very good history with it. I think it's kind of it's a multiracially owned home, which is kind of cool. Especially since it started to be that way in the 19th century, which was unusual.
Yeah, I didn't realize your house had that African American history until you mentioned it. So yeah. It is cool. That is a cool feature. So at the moment, there's no questions, but
Madam Facilitator.
Go ahead, John Peter.
Hi. So Jack, the you called it the North Road, the sunken road down that the tobacco barrels went down. Is that, I was sort of led to believe that it got that sunken nature because those tobacco barrels were rolled down, or was it just a natural ravine? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I'm not really quite sure about that, whether it was, it seems to me like it might not be so natural. Now, I've never really actually thought about this, but yeah, I believe that was definitely, I believe it was carved into the properties for that purpose.
Yeah, it always made sense to me that those tobacco barrels were not 50-pound barrels. That we're talking 500 pounds to 1,000 pounds. These are big barrels, so it seemed to be a reasonable story to me without me doing any, thinking through that it could have been maybe it was naturally inclined, and then you roll the barrels for a couple hundred years down to the river, and you get this sort of sunken road down to the river.
Yeah, it must have been pretty interesting because these ships had to be high out of the water. So I don't know once they got down to the river, I don't know how they actually got them on the ship. They must have hoisted them on or something. But yeah, it's pretty interesting because on my property, I have 1 acre, and there's a lot of evidence of stoops, and there were actually other buildings on. There was lots of buildings on my plot over the years, and they've fallen down or whatever. There was a poultry barn or shed, and there was all kinds of different things going on that property. So
And that would have been pretty common in
yeah,
the 18th and 19th century. You didn't just have a house with maybe one outbuilding. You had all kinds of structures on your property.
yeah.
I have one other, it's more an observation. When you mention the little strips of wood for your windows, I remember that for our old greenhouses that my family had, I used to, when the glass to the old greenhouses would break, we had those little strips so that you could quickly replace broken glass in a greenhouse.
Yeah, they're really wonderful because things happen, and yeah, you could literally take them out and put a new piece of glass in,
And those tiny little nails, and you just, yeah, I remember that, and I hadn't thought about it for decades until you brought it up, and I thought, oh, I know how this works.
yeah, but it's unusual. I've been involved in a lot of historic homes and restoration projects, and I rarely ever see this feature. So
Well, thank you, Jack. I think that's my observations and questions, and I found this fascinating.
I was gonna say, if anybody has something they want to put in the chat, or I don't know if you can unmute yourself, but let me know somehow that you want to talk. I will unmute you if you can't. Okay. Well, I don't see anybody's hands raised or trying to unmute, and no questions.
I'm trying to unmute.
Oh, there you go. Okay. Go, Nay.
Jack, I remember the last time I was at your house. I think you had a housewarming or something, and I really liked the way the wraparound porch was. But if I'm not mistaken, the little house on the right, didn't you say that you changed that into a guest house?
well, yeah, it's always been it's been like a guest house ever since they stopped using the summer kitchen. People stayed in there.
Uh,
I just cleaned it up.
so now you use it as your office?
No. It's still used as a place to sleep, a guest house. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And so what's pretty interesting is that I'm part of the Maryland House and Garden Pilgrimage, and St. Thomas Parish is my church, St. Thomas Church, and we're actually for 2023, we're in talks of having another tour. And we are going to base this tour on the African American history of our area down in Nottingham and Upper Marlboro. And what we're talking about, this is premature, but we're talking about going to different historical homes and different historical sites, and also newer, fantastic homes of African American people that live in our community. And we are going to try to do this around Juneteenth, because we really want to bring people down into that part of the county and introduce them to the history, because the history of that part of the county is really, of course, it has bad history, but it also has good history. I didn't talk about the African American history since the Civil War, but the area down in that part of Prince George's County has a lot of older African American families that have been around forever and ever. And for many, many, many years since the Civil War, and throughout the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, and 80s, until tobacco farming was stopped, a lot of people, worked and farmed these tobacco farms. And so you will find that there's a lot of families that are still there that have been there for years. And there's a certain closeness to these families with the families that own these farms. And when I first came down to the area in the 80s, and I started going to St. Thomas Church, and I got to know a lot of the families, like the Downey family, and which bought these farms and continued to tobacco farm them. A lot of the African American people that work for them, there was a really tight bond with the Downey family and a lot of these different families that helped out with these farms. And so I think that that what we want to do is, when we have our next tour, we want to show some of these wonderful parts of our county and the history.
Well, how many families are down there?
There's quite a few families that are still left. Yeah, there's the Wiseman family, and there's still some Savoys left, and I mean there's quite a few people that still live in the area.
Mhm.
So
And is there a historical church?
there is. It's Brookfield Methodist Church is the historic church.
Brookfield.
Yeah, Brookfield Methodist Church, and then there's also the Church of Myers. Was it Brooks Myers?
Not
Yes,
Nottingham.
okay.
Nottingham Myers.
Nottingham Myers is the African American historic church. And
That's the church with the beautiful, I hope it's still beautiful, vaulted ceiling.
yeah, and that's the church that the commission saved. We were able to save that, and that was a great thing that the commission was able to work with the church and allow them to build their newer structure that fit the needs that they have in today's world, but yet worked with them and helped them to understand the importance of saving the original church. So, it was a wonderful thing that the commissioners did and staff did to work with them to save that church.
Well, you say that there are a lot of families. There are a lot of other historic homes.
Well, there are other historic structures and properties throughout the area. Yes.
Are they on the register?
Some of them are on the register. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, that's all my questions.
Okay. Well, Stacy Hawkins mentions great hearing the history and seeing the house in the chat. So does anybody else have anything they would like to put in the chat or comment upon tonight? Okay, I don't see anything else. So again, thank you, Jack. Greatly appreciate you joining us this evening. And I want to mention to our audience, that we always appreciate your participation because we continue to have an audience for these history chats. We're going to continue providing them. And if anybody has any suggestions for a topic, feel free to reach out to the Historical Society and let us know. We're happy to do chats on subjects that are of interest to our members and audience. If you are already a society member, thank you very much. I mean, I think everybody on here tonight actually is. But if not, please consider making a donation or becoming a member, which you can do through our website. September 15th is the Society's 70th anniversary, and we are going to be having our Prince of a County celebration again. This year, it's going to be at Mount Lubentia. And that's going to be on September 18th. If you've received our newsletter, a little bit of the details are in there, but an invitation will be coming out later in August with more information. And we hope you can join us then. Our next history chat will be on August 22nd with Marvin Alonzo Greer. He's the lead historic interpretation and community engagement officer for Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission. And he's going to be talking about the commission's new mobile history museum. So I hope you can join us for that. And if there's nothing further, then I want to say goodnight to everybody and see you next month.
Bye. Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Jack.
Bye.
Bye.
Very nice, very nice.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Really very interesting.